the vote to elevate his people, but also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched.
Please welcome Chair of the National Archives Foundation, Governor Jim Blanchard.
Board. But I Meadows and Debbie Meadows, they've been good friends of the archives. Please stand. And I cannot see with these lights as to whether District Judge for District of Columbia, Beryl also Senior U.S. District Judge Royce Lambeth of the District of Columbia. Thank you for being with us. Now, a special friend of one of our board members is Mayor Mary Marvin, the mayor of Bronxville, New York. Welcome. And one of my pals I want to introduce, because he's not only a friend of the archives and a lover of history, but now what luck, he happens to be General Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget, Mark Paoletta. And Tricia, please, thanks for coming, please. And two other former colleagues of mine in Congress, former Congressman Tom McMillan and Congressman Charlie Dent. Please rise, please. On their way is our ambassador to Canada, U.S. Ambassador Kelly Knight Craft, and her husband Joe. And I have a feeling because they were flying in, the weather may have altered their plans. They are here now? Please, please stand. Where are they? All right. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. You've had a busy Party had power. Each my powers day to which are special librarian socks, available in our shop, by the way, and online. You can order them online. Very time. Of women make her both an obvious choice for this award and for the launch of our Women's Vote Centennial celebration. Laura Bush has been an educator, a librarian, the First Lady of Texas, the First Lady of the United States, and a global advocate through the George W. Bush Presidential Center. The common thread linking her life's work together is this intrinsic love of learning that she continues to share with the world. Laura Bush's educational work through the Bush Center in programs such as Middle School Matters, the School Leadership Initiative, Advancing Accountability in Education, and of course my favorite, your Foundation for America's Libraries, all demonstrate a commitment and passion for ensuring a literate society. This mission was what President Franklin Roosevelt had in mind when he created the National Archives, a mission which continues to be vital to our democracy. Laura Bush said, "We must prepare our children and grandchildren with the tools they need to be informed, engaged citizens who care about individual liberty and democracy. We must teach them history. We must insist they understand the government they are blessed to live under. We must teach our children to listen, to show empathy, to show civility in the face of disagreement, and to overcome malice and hate. And we must model the behavior ourselves." At the National Archives, we work to provide students of all ages with the tools they need to understand history and become active participants in our government. We recently launched the Civic Education webpage to make our education initiatives accessible to parents, teachers, and students. Docs Teach, our online tool for teaching with documents, features more than 10,000 primary source documents and interactive activities for teachers and students. We make history fun with sleepovers in the rotunda upstairs. Coming up this weekend, as a matter of fact, Saturday night, our latest, with a theme of Native Americans. And we host a variety of educational programs across the country throughout the year. We would not be here tonight if it wasn't for our partner, the National Archives Foundation, helping the National Archives reach an ever larger and more diverse audience. Together, we make civic literacy a reality. With the support of the Foundation and generous benefactors like you, we celebrated our 4th annual July reading of the 4th of July reading of the Declaration of Independence
on the steps of this building. We hosted 2 widely popular National Archives sleepovers, and we'll launch our next exhibit, Rightfully Hers, this March on the 19th Amendment and women's right to vote in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. Tonight, we celebrate this shared vision between Laura Bush and the National Archives family. Through the work of the former First Lady, the National Archives, and the National Archives Foundation, we're striving for a nation in which the world a better place. Celebrate our public-private partnership with the Foundation and pay tribute to Laura Bush.
Ladies and gentlemen, I present our 2018 Records of Achievement honoree, Laura Bush. Please. And chair of our National Archives Foundation, the best vice chair. We give this award each year. It's special. We try to make this to the honoree. A lot of this.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you very much. I did love the Laura Bush, the Laura Ingalls Wilder books. And so this is a really wonderful. Really, that's where her grandfather is. And she wanted to be with him. And so we his Mila, Jenna's little who was very proud of being a ring bearer. During of course, the box was empty because they knew that she couldn't really have the ring. So Craig had it in his pocket.
Poppy is the baby.
Bobby's 3-year-old. With so it was a lot of fun. We flew from Maine. Yeah.
Where I was just with you and your daughters and their cousins in Dallas, honoring Barbara Bush's literacy heritage, and we had a panel of the grandchildren, which was hysterical. Bush.
Started said he never had liked those tacos.
All those years he had put up with them. So the last time I think you were on this stage, at least the last time I was with you on this stage, you were here with Michelle Obama, which you've done several times. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. But first I want to talk about they don't accept what you choose to create our own kind of quoting you here than they ever get treated in the media. And I think what happens is a story goes up about them, a myth that people stick to for all coverage of them forever after. And you felt that
And of
happen
course,
with them.
I was the quiet reader and librarian.
Right, right.
And I was that. I mean, that, there's no doubt about it. But all of our first ladies have been a lot more complicated and have been very constructive for our country from the very beginning.
From the very beginning. One of the great myths that, they were sitting around pouring tea until Eleanor Roosevelt or something, makes me crazy. But so you've just had at the Bush Center, which is the library part of it is part of the National Archives, a First Lady's special exhibit. Please tell me it wasn't about dresses.
There were a few gowns in it, but no, it was not about dresses, and we didn't want it to be about dresses. With some of Nancy Reagan's clothes, but we wanted this to be substantive because we knew that besides wearing lovely gowns, that our first ladies had made so many contributions to our country. So one gown that was there that I think is interesting was a mock-up of a gown that Dolly Madison made out of the red velvet drapes that she saved from the White House when the British burned the White House.
Where's it been saved?
Well, no, this was a copy.
Copy.
It was a copy of it, so I think the dress was not saved.
Not saved.
But we talked about the contributions that each First Lady had made. It was a show that we did ourselves that the Bush Library curators came up with. And this does give me the chance to thank the National Archives because, of course, the National Archives administer the President's papers. The President's papers are seen as belonging to the people of the United States, and the Archives administration is a very important part. Of course, the storage of all the papers that are there at the Bush Library. And so I want to thank the National Archives and the archivists and everyone here for your work. And of course, those employees at the Bush Library of the government.
And again, you said, and you had a very interesting kind of session with those of us who are historians, et cetera, as you were leaving the White House. So I've written down every word. Yeah, sure. And you said, every time I spoke out about something, even heart disease, I would be surprised again at how many people heard me. And I often use Lady Bird Johnson's quote about the First Lady has a podium. And while she was here, she said, I've decided to use it. And you quoted her often about that. And you did take that to heart, deciding to use it.
That's right. And of course, we knew Lady Bird. She was a Texas First Lady. And when she opened the Wildflower Center, close to outside of Austin, we hosted, George was governor, and we hosted on the lawn of the governor's mansion the picnic for the opening of the Wildflower Center, and then went out that night to the opening gala of the National Wildflower Center. And I always really admired Lady Bird Johnson.
Except
and I
for
like
Billboard.
that. Two states actually managed it. Vermont, lone Republican in Vermont, when George ran for president the first time, and he said that they had stayed in suits until just recently to be able to outlaw billboards.
But you then started using that podium at first for things that you had done before, the book festival, literacy. You did a big conference on cognitive development in early childhood. And on your way to the Capitol to testify before the Senate Education Committee, why people thought you were not out there.
That I just where we were obviously neighbor countries. The world. And then really
I mean, well, first of all, I should say, by the way, that Mrs. Bush and Senator Kennedy were together pretty much all day as you were trying to figure out what was going on. And Senator Kennedy later said, you get to know somebody in a situation like that. And he said she was steady, assured, and elegant.
that was sweet.
Well,
He kept up a steady stream of small talk. And he showed me everything on his office walls. He read me a letter that his brother Jack had written to their mother that said, Teddy is getting fat. And he laughed at it. And I never knew if that was the way he had to deal with the trauma, because he'd had so many in his life, or if he thought I'd fall apart. And so he just felt like he had to keep up this, small talk. And then Senator Judd Gregg, who was the minority chairman of the Education Committee, joined us from New Hampshire, and one of our best friends, still one of our best friends. We see him a lot. We're going to see him and have dinner with him next weekend when they'll be in Dallas. His son has moved to Fort Worth. And Judd and I would sort of look at each other while Senator Kennedy talked and told stories and told us things about his office. And so I don't know if he did it because that was just the way he reacted, or if he thought he needed to for me.
Right.
But anyway, then we went out to talk to the press and tell them that obviously the briefing had been canceled, postponed. We were already, you're not going to stop us. We're going to do it later. And he changed his whole personality, became very serious and perfect for the press, really, under the circumstances. And then I did brief the Senate committee a couple of months later.
But you said, I grew in both my realization that I had a podium, but also in my expertise about some international issues that I didn't come to the White House with. And that really did change a lot of you. I think But you did always in the military government of Burma. Big time.
I did. I was a secret friend of Aung San Suu Kyi, where I could send her things. And I would get messages of things she wanted, like seaweed. I think she liked to eat seaweed or drink seaweed or something. And I would always send her a book that I liked, that I thought maybe she would like. So during all those years, I had this friendship with Aung San Suu Kyi and would send her various items and paid a lot of attention to her. And then finally, when we left, she was under house arrest for all those years. By the time we left, she had been able to be the leader of Burma. But now, as we're watching, we don't know what to think with the Rohingyas. I don't know if the military, who always really were the ones that were in power during the whole time, even though she'd been elected president. I don't know if it's a military thing and she's compromised by the military. Right. I'm not sure, because now I'm not in contact with her anymore.
Yeah. But you went to the press room, the briefing room. You were on your way to Jenna's wedding, as I recall. Had a few things to do on the home front, but went into the press room. Now, no First Lady's ever done that before or since. You grabbed the microphone and basically used it to denounce the military rule in Burma, because they were not responding to a cyclone where they
No, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think it is really nice. And then
fact.
that's
On the
that. In many cases, in many parts of the world, don't have the sort of platform that American First Ladies have. And we build that kind of platform because they can. The very first thing we did was an African First Ladies Conference when we were in Africa. And we work with the First Ladies themselves, but also our staff work with their staffs to try to figure out ways they can set up their offices so that the First Ladies can be more effective. Because when you have both leaders, the husband and the wife, working, you can do twice as much. So the first African First Ladies Conference, we hosted in Africa, and Michelle Obama was there, so she could come to it.
Well, it was better than that. Because I had the great honor of being the person to interview the two. And then my husband said, "Why not?" And there were the two of them. And it was, first of all, it was such an important symbol for the First Ladies of Africa to see this
Well, that is a symbol, because in many cases they would never, and they said this, never speak to the leader that was before them because they were corrupt, or, there was some other reason. They wouldn't have that continuity that we have with our former presidents and former First Ladies. And it is kind of like a club, just like the National Governors Association gives you the chance to be with other governors and their spouses, and gives you a chance to know what's going on. It's really very helpful, I think, for First Ladies to be together, and I think it's a great example both for Americans to see and for other for people in other countries to see.
But I remember when I asked at that point, because you had basically said to Mrs. Obama, come and do whatever you want to do, right? You can make a speech, you can, and she could have hijacked it, frankly, right?
She wouldn't have.
No, I know, and you knew that, and she wanted to be in a, as I was, Mrs. Obama, you wanted to be in this conversation. It was feel good the following year, and brought the African First Ladies here.
During the UNGA in New York, when their spouses were in New York for the General Assembly, we hosted it then.
And then you and Mrs. Obama did an event here, I think just this year. Or was it last year? 2 years. Oh my goodness, time flies. But this is what happens when you get old. You think it was 5 minutes.
She was First Lady.
But it was on military spouses, right? And
Time continually.
where that was considered, I don't know what.
I don't know why that was so fascinating, but
But you do say that there is this bond among First Ladies.
yeah, for sure. I mean, everyone knows, the First Ladies know what it's like, and they're friendly with each other. Maybe they wouldn't be friendly if they'd run against each other, but
Although the presidents end up being friends. I remember actually interviewing President Bush 41 soon after he left office, and he said, I can't imagine that I'll ever be friends with Clinton the way that Ford and Carter are. And then he became a fifth son.
yeah, exactly. Well, of course, that also speaks to how President Bush is, which is so great, and he's so courtly, and he's so, that's just how he is, that he would be friends with anyone. He would never have a feud with somebody that beat him in some. bit what any and he's here. We St. Martin's. Then we drove to College Station, where their gravesite is, at the Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M University. So we drove there, and we had a police escort, and they just would stop the cars at the access roads before they got on. They didn't really hold up a lot of traffic, but we'd look down at the access roads, and those Texans would be out of their cars, and those Texas men would have their cowboy hats over their hearts. It was really, really sweet. And then when we got to Texas A&M, we walked with the casket by 700 saluting Texas A&M cadets.
Fabulous.
It was really lovely, and it was perfect.
It
for
was
Barr.
perfect. It was perfect in every way. I mean, I was covering it on television and weeping my way through, but happy tears, because it was.
She was ready to go, and
Well, tell
so
the
that-
story that
that encouraged us.
she told your husband about.
well, so George called her. We had seen her; she had fallen, and we'd been in Houston. Had lunch with him. fallen, so George and I went by to to see her. I think that all the other kids did, but we had just seen her. And so George called her and said, "Mother, you were a wonderful mother, and I'm so glad you were my mother, and thank you for everything." And she said, "Well," and he said, "I love you." And she said, "Well, I love you too, George." And she said, "You're my favorite son." On the phone. So she stayed funny and quick till
Ever-
really it's very and when the doctor said, "No, why?" And she said, "Because I drank and smoked when I was pregnant with him." Bad.
on a children are right.
Inherited the institutions that we inherited and all the ones that support our democracy. And it's really important for people to know about them and to be proud of it. Why not
Right.
be proud of it? One of the things we're working on with women from Tunisia and Egypt, and that we started with at the Bush Institute with those women from those two countries because they were the two Arab Spring countries. But they don't have the institutions to support a democracy. And it's been very hard, and both countries have sort of slid back. And we inherited those institutions. We didn't have to do anything for them. We were just lucky to get them. And it's really important, I think, for people to know that and to know about them. The reason we can have a democracy is I think it's about test. And then if it's on the test, they'll teach it.
Right. No, it's true. So-
Exactly.
Well, thank you for all of your teaching
Thank you
over
very
the
much.
many
Thank you,
years
Kofi.
and the wonderful work that you continue to do.
Thank you very
And
much.
congratulations
And thanks
on
to
this.
everybody. Thank you for your support for the National Archives. I encourage you to give more to the foundation.
Yes. Laura and Koki, thank you for allowing us to enjoy your conversation. And Laura Bush, thank you for your service to our country and for helping build a better world. Thank you. Now, I will all of you, as we finish the program, to join us upstairs in the Rotunda Galleries for our gala dinner, our annual gala dinner. And thank you again, all of you, for coming.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Corinne Porter, curator for our upcoming exhibition, Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here to the William G. McGowan Theater in Washington, D.C. for our program, Women's Suffrage D.C. or watching. This evening's program is presented 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, and we thank them for their support. Book signings in the theater lobby with two of our panelists, Feminism, Moneyed Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, 18 of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to tell you about our exhibition that's opening in March of 2019. Commemorates the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment by looking beyond suffrage parades and protests, this landmark moment in American history. This fuller retelling illustrates the dynamic involvement of American women across the spectrums of race, ethnicity, and class, to reveal what it really takes to win the vote for one half of the people. Now I'm pleased to welcome to the stage Nancy Tate, former executive director of the National League of Women Voters and co-chair of the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, and Susan Carter, National Women's Party board president.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you to the National Archives who are having us here this evening. This is a great opportunity, especially during Women's History Month. As mentioned, I'm Nancy Tate, the former executive director of the League of Women Voters of the United States. The League is honored to be a co-chair of the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, or WVCI. WVCI is an information sharing collaborative of organizations and scholars around the country to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 72-year fight for women to win the vote and to shed light on this powerful history that too few people understand. The League itself was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the head of the largest women's suffrage organization, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and thus is one of only two successor organizations to that suffrage fight. So for us, 2020 is also the 100th anniversary of the League. And for almost 100 years now, we've continued the fight for full equality for all, both through education and advocacy, working from the national level and with our nearly 800 state and local leagues. But let me tell you a little bit more about the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative. We worked to establish and to build upon networks in all the states with interested organizations and individuals to promote celebrations around the country about the suffrage centennial. In the D.C. area, we sponsor programs such as this and coordinate and collaborate with some of the national museums here, such as Tonight's program is part of a series called the Women in Vote Symposium Series. This is the second starting last year in 2017, continuing through 2020. In each, the focus will be on different aspects of the suffrage. And doing that in a way that highlights the connection of aspects of that fight to issues of relevance today. The purpose of these programs is to be educational about a factor, a time period, and an effort in U.S. history that is too little understood, and to create a drumbeat of awareness and appreciation for as we move towards 2020. The 72-year fight for women's suffrage is a powerful historical story, and that can be used to enhance our understanding of our own time and how to navigate it. You can learn more about WVCI and the suffrage activities around the country that we carry by following us on Facebook. on 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative and on both Twitter and Instagram at 2020 Centennial. So I've been pleased to co-chair the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative with the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party is the only other successor organization to the suffrage movement, which is why our two organizations decided to work together on commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment.
And I also want to thank Corinne and the National Archives for inviting us to have this conversation here this evening and hosting us, and for the important work that they do to promote women's history. Thank you. In 1913, a well-educated Quaker named Alice Paul founded what would a few years later become the National Woman's Party. She had a particular goal in mind. She wanted a federal amendment to the Constitution that enfranchised women, and she was growing impatient with having waited for 60 years to win this vote. So Alice Paul and her National Woman's Party colleague pursued truly groundbreaking strategies and tactics that we've since seen used in other parts of the civil rights movement. They picketed the White House. They made suffrage an election issue for men running for office. They created a brand around suffrage so it was recognizable to everyone. They lobbied Congress and state legislatures. They cultivated media attention brilliantly, I would say. And they barnstormed across the country, speaking on street corners and, of course, raising money for their cause. These committed women were also willing to sacrifice in truly amazing ways. Many of them were beaten, arrested, brutally force-fed in prison when they went on hunger strikes, but they ultimately helped win the vote. It's an amazing story, and one that you see come to life when you come to the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. The National Women's Party moved into the house that is that monument now in 1929. That move was made possible by a wealthy New York socialite named Alva Belmont, who also happened to be a car. 1923, and we wrote dozens of pieces of legislation that ultimately passed that expanded legal rights for women. Today, we're a 501c3 nonprofit educational organization. Since the house was made a national monument in 2016, we have a wonderful partnership with the National Park Service. The National Park Service operates the house, fixed the leaky roof, those kinds of things, and we own, maintain, and curate the historical collection, which includes banners, capes, costumes, photographs, political cartoons, organizational records, and so on. It's truly a special place, and if you haven't visited it, please do. We also host salons at the house where we talk about issues like this one tonight. We are very excited to be approaching the 100th anniversary of the vote. We're really pleased to be co-chairing WVCI with the League of Women's Voters and working with other organizations across the country. We in the National Women's Party view this as an opportunity not only to make sure that this important history is shared more broadly, but to engage the dialogue around what is the unfinished business of women's equality, what is left to do. And so we're organizing a lot of discussions around this and making plans around that for the Centennial. But let's begin our program. We have a really great panel here tonight, and I want to introduce our moderator, Paige Harrington. Paige is a consulting public historian specializing in early 20th century women's history. She advises museums on creative and practical strategies. Was the executive director of the National Women's Party and was with us as we worked through the monument designation. Her forthcoming book, Interpreting Suffrage, Women's Equality, and Racism at Museums and Historic Sites, will be released in the spring of 2019. Thank you, Paige, for agreeing to moderate the discussion tonight. We look forward to the conversation and now invite the panel to come up on the stage. Thank you.
We will. There you have it. definitely.
Women don't follow directions, and that's why they get their rights.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thank you all for being here. This is going to be a terrific conversation, and I want to start by introducing our wonderful panelists. Joan Marie Johnson is a historian and author of many articles and books on women and philanthropy, race, reform, and education. Her new book, Funding Feminism, Moneyed Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, 1870 to 1967. Joan taught women's history at Northeastern Illinois University for 12 years. She was also the co-founder and co-director of the Newberry Seminar on Women and Gender at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and she now works as the director for faculty in the Office of the Provost at Northwestern University. Welcome, Joan. Author and journalist A'Lelia Bundles is at work on her 5th book, The Joy Goddess of Harlem, A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, a biography of her great-grandmother, whose parties, friendships, international travels, and arts patronage helped define the era. On her own ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, her biography of her great-great-grandmother, was named a New York Times notable book. A'Lelia was a network television news executive and producer for 30 years at NBC News. Sarah Briner joined the Center for Responsive Politics in 2011. She oversees the data analysis and research collaborations. Previously, she was CRP's lobbying and revolving door researcher. Prior to joining Open Secrets, Sarah was a doctoral student at The Ohio State University, where she also taught undergraduate politics science courses. Her dissertation, Politicians Behaving Badly, The Determinants and Outcomes of Political Scandal in Post-Watergate America, incorporates both original data and political experiments. She received her PhD from Ohio State in 2014 and her BA in Political Science and Biology in 2006. So welcome, Sarah. And from male donors helped move the campaign along. You'll remember that this was a 72-year campaign, so it was going to take a lot of donors. So tonight we'll talk about, and each of the panelists will give a short introduction about what they're going to talk about. But I want to also, just as a quick preface, say that while there were many organizations and individuals that funded the right to vote or the campaign for suffrage over that 72 years, there were also plenty of organizations and also individuals who were anti-suffragist. And so they funded, of course, the opposite political. So it's interesting when you look back, a lot of the anti-suffrage comes from individuals who thought that politics was way too rough and tumble for women, that women were much too ethical and moral, they should stay above the fray, meaning not get into the street fights over politics and such. But most people thought it's equal rights. If they're going to be half the country, they should at least have the vote. There were a lot of organizations that funded the anti-suffrage campaigns, primarily from the liquor industry and also from the manufacturing industry. They thought for certain that if women had the right to vote, that they would vote for more labor laws, that they would vote for perhaps prohibition, for temperance, and that would obviously hit their bottom line. So there were, just as there is today, there were political and organizational and also individuals who voted for and against and showed that with their money. So why don't we start with just a quick overview from each of the panelists. Joan, why don't you go first?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to Nancy and Susan for putting this together. It's really great to have the opportunity to talk about women and money and politics. Yeah. So my book, Funding Feminism, Moneyed Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, covers from 1870 to 1967, and it's about wealthy women who donated large amounts of money to the women's movement, in particular for the right to vote, in support of the birth control movement, to expand access to higher education for women, and also to support women in the labor movement. And in the course of writing the book, I really made two main arguments. And the first is very simple, but I think really very important, and that is that women need to make change for women. And male allies are wonderful, and we need them as well. But really, it is the power of women organizing for themselves. And in this case, women really were outnumbered as well as outgave men to the suffrage movement, especially the National Women's Party. Their largest donors were women. And they were giving small donations. You can see the list of donors goes everywhere from 25 cents up into the tens of thousands and even higher. And those large donations really made a difference, and I'll talk about their impact in a minute. The other argument that I make in the book is that like business and they couldn't, or they had a husband who abused them in one form or another. And so they saw some sense of sisterhood with all women, and exploring how they were at times able to cross some of those bridges of class and race, and then the moments where they failed, especially when they really failed to see women of color as part of that sisterhood, I think is really important as we think about the movement today, and having a different kind of, much more inclusive movement. So I'll stop there. And
Absolutely. Excellent. Lilia.
That was a perfect intro for me.
Perfect.
So I'm going to talk, I'm centering my comments sort of based on Madam C.J. Walker, my great-great-grandmother, who was a pioneer of the modern hair care industry. And so you don't necessarily think of beauty shops and hair care as a place that has anything to do with funding or politics. But in fact, it was always very much a part of what she was doing. So Madam C.J. Walker, who was born Sarah Breed Love 2 years after the end of the Civil War, first child in her family born free, was born in an area where there had been a lot of political activity for African Americans during Reconstruction. That was all taken away during Jim Crow. But as Madam Walker moved from washerwoman to entrepreneur, she was influenced by the National Association of Colored Women. That organization was founded in 1896 after a group of African American women really were excluded from some of the suffrage groups, and they created their own group. And there's a much longer story to that, but that's a little bit of in a nutshell. She modeled some of her organization of her sales agents after the National Association of Colored Women. So in 1917, 2 years before Mary Kay was born, Madam Walker had her first convention of her sales agents. 200 African American women came from all over the United States. These were women who had been sharecroppers and maids and laundresses and cooks who didn't have other opportunities open to them. But at the convention, Madam Walker gave prizes, just like Mary Kay later would do, to the women who sold the most products. But she also gave prizes to the women who had contributed the most to charity in their communities, in their state and local clubs. In her keynote speech, the theme was women's duty to women. And she said to the women, I want others to look at us and realize that as Walker agents, we care not just about ourselves, but about others. That would make lynching a federal crime. So there was always a political component, and it was creating economic independence for African American women. So 90% of African Americans were living in the South with very little economic opportunity. Women would write to Madam Walker and say, you have made it possible for a colored woman, because that's what we called ourselves at the time, to make more money in a day selling your products than she could in a month working in somebody's home. Now, I will also talk about the very important work that Professor Tiffany Gill, who's at the University of Delaware, has done in her book, Beauty Shop Politics. And what Tiffany argues is that these seeds that were planted with Madam Walker and some of the other women in the early 20th century who were involved in, as beauticians who were involved in organizations, National Association of Colored Women, that carried forward through the decades of the 20th century into the civil rights movement. A. Philip Randolph's wife, Lucille Green, was a beautician. He said that he was able to do his work with the March on Washington and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters because of the money she made in her beauty salon. During the civil rights movement, when the churches became targets, black women owned their beauty shops. They were able to have meetings. They helped fund some of the buses to the March on Washington. So you can see that there was a direct line between some things that happened early in the 20th century into the civil rights movement.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you. So I'm here representing the Center for Responsive Politics, and just before I start, a little background on what we do. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization which tracks the influence of money in federal elections. So we have wide-reaching data resources going back to 1989. Individuals to federal political entities, be them candidates in the early days, and super PACs and other organizations like that today. So that's probably accesses one of the sort of viewpoints that I have a specific level of interest in, which is donors to political campaigns and whether or not they're men or women, where they're coming from, who they are, who they work for. We do know the gender of those donors, and that data I spend a lot of time working with. And particularly since 2016, that data can provide a lot of interesting information about sort of how politicians right now are getting their money and the role that women play in funding those campaigns. And I'll just tell you that this particular election cycle, 2018, is very, very different from previous election cycles in terms of how many women are donating, how important those women are to political campaigns. Just one number that I keep coming up against is 39 campaigns so far have relied on more than 50% of their donors as being women. And that's more than any previous cycle in history already in the cycle. Mm-hmm. So Hillary Clinton was the first candidate, major party presidential candidate, to take more than 50% of her money from women. And that seems to have continued on today. Now, the problem that we see when we look at that data is that all of those 39 people are either, or nearly all, I think it's 95%, are Democrats or Democrat-aligned politicians like Bernie Sanders. So there's a huge disconnect when you look at this data. She mentioned race. That's an issue as well. But then the one that we focus more on is party. Clearly, there are Republican women that matter, and there are Republican women in the United States, but they are not participating in federal elections in the same way that their Democratic counterparts are. Mm-hmm. And that's become more exacerbated this cycle. And that partially could be just because we're looking at a blue wave, and it's a competitive cycle for Democrats right now. But this has been flat for Republican women since 1989. I think the increase in the percentage of women candidates for the Republican Party is under 5% in that time period, whereas Democratic women have started to make up a larger. You know, it's important to Congress is largely just of liberals. And that's something that we shouldn't forget when we have these discussions. Mm-hmm. So that's my sort of starting point. And I have a lot of numbers in my head for gender data, and hopefully we'll get to engage.
Excellent, excellent. Well, one of the things that fascinated me, Sarah was kind enough to send me one of the most recent reports that her organization has done, and she is right, it is chock full of numbers. and very fascinating. And then I also got a chance to read Alelia's book and Joan's book, and the similarities between all three is really just astonishing. But what is really profound, I think, is the fact that we're talking about late 1800s into the 1920s and then into the 1950s, and then, you know, taking place this entire time. So it's absolutely fascinating. So we'll have time for questions at the end, but I would like to start with Joan. One of the big issues that I think cuts across all of the panelists that are here today, one of the big issues is the societal discomfort with women and power and money. So women who have money and how they exert that money for power. Society tends to be uncomfortable about that. So do you want to start with that, and we'll see if everyone else can add a little bit to it?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that happened with our history of the women's suffrage movement is that a lot of the wealthy women and their role were not the focus of that history for a lot of different reasons. And for myself, having written about women, white women, women of color, I was accustomed to writing about women as being somewhat on the margins. And to think about these wealthy women was quite interesting for me personally. But what I came to really see was that they were able to use their money as a voice, to give them voice at a time when women had very little political voice. And they also, many of them really realized that in order to be able to have a voice out in public, and they really needed to do this education campaign, in other words, a publicity campaign, and that cost a lot of money. And so I think that discomfort with women and wealth in some ways put what they did off to the side, but it was quite impactful.
Mm-hmm. And it was discomfort at multiple levels.
It was. Mm-hmm.
The women themselves were uncomfortable. There's a very interesting portion of the book where you talk about Alva Belmont being one of the big benefactors, but she was very reticent to actually march in one of the parades because that was very unladylike.
Mm-hmm. Although she was very comfortable using her money to get her way, which is kind of interesting. So Alva Belmont, the headquarters for NASA, which was the National Women's Suffrage Association, the headquarters was the desk of the treasurer who lived in Warren, Ohio. I've never been to Warren, Ohio. I'm sure Warren, Ohio is lovely, but yeah. When you read the letters of the suffragists, they're saying, Mrs. Belmont, and they're only getting the positions that they're getting within these organizations because of their money, and they're only able to force us to make these decisions about where headquarters are going to be or who's going to be holding office or whether or not we're going to do certain things because of their money power. So that was a big issue.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And again, that's one part of the book that I read and thought that we could be talking about today or yesterday or tomorrow, because some of those sentiments are certainly what we're seeing. Alelia, can you talk a little bit about the very early years for Madam Walker? So when she was starting her organization, that takes entrepreneur to a whole new level in my eyes, because you're starting with something, you're starting with absolutely nothing, and you also have nothing to base it on. There is no template. No one else had done this. So can you share just a little bit of that?
Sure. I mean, she literally was the first born free. And beginning, but influential woman, and at one time the president of the National Association of Colored Women. There were not women in leadership roles in the National Negro Business League, and she challenged him publicly at a convention because he wasn't giving her an opportunity to speak. But she believed that she was really developing a business that was empowering women. And she talked about women becoming economically independent. Some men resented that. They didn't think women should have their own money, that they shouldn't work outside the home. But she knew that there had been people like her. She had been widowed. She was raising a child. There were women who had to work. They could only get jobs as washerwomen. And she wanted them to have economic independence. And you see that sort of going forward again into the civil rights movement when you're talking about people resenting women, the women who were in the leadership roles of these activists, and they were saying, we really need people in our community, and they were throwing a bit of shade on some of the black ministers who weren't being
information about the number of women who, the number that I remember from the report is that women make up 31% of all donations, no matter whether they're male or female candidates?
Right. So that's true for this cycle.
Okay.
So about a third of all federal contributions. So slowly across cycles with kind of a pretty major uptick this cycle, whereas the line for Republicans has remained fairly flat. And there are variations. There tends to be more support from women donors during cycles like 2018 and 2010, where you have a lot of challengers and a lot of new blood in the political system. And that engages more donations from women. I think that there's so much of this is tied to our Congress has such an incumbency preference, and incumbents tend to be male, and they tend to be white males. And so when you have challengers, in order to make progress in terms of the number of women in Congress, you need to have elections where you have competitive seats, you have a lot of competition, you have a lot of retirements, and that's true for 2010, where we see a slightly larger increase in the number of women Republicans both running and donating. And then it's definitely true in 2018, where we see a pretty major increase in the amount of women running and donating. And this cycle is the first cycle I've ever seen where we've seen nearly every member of Congress has a challenger at this point. And you might laugh and say, well, isn't that always the case? No, it is not always the case. You'd be astonished at how frequently members of Congress run without any competition at all, not even a warm body. And this cycle, I think the number decreases every time I look, but we're down to about 25 Republicans who have no challenger right now. And so that's going to create opportunities sort of go into office, and opportunities, and those opportunities will also drive and be fed by engagement by women donors.
Right, right. So it's interesting when you're talking about that. It makes me think of Joan in your book when you talk about it's not just the number of women donors that increased, but it's also that the women were giving more money. So as you said in the beginning, some of the donations were as small as 25 cents, but then some of the women gave $10,000 and even more, especially when you aggregate it for today's dollars. It's astonishing what they gave. But you remarked in your book that it was also that the money came in at the right time. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the fact that they got the money and they were in larger quantities. It's the fact that it came in at the right time, so they were able to push the movement a little bit more forward, which sounds like what you're talking about when you say that the donors are coming in and you've got this more of an increase in candidates, but it is very similar. Do you want to talk a little bit about the influx of some of those bigger dollars in the suffrage campaign? I'm thinking in particular of Mrs. Frank Leslie and the Carrie Chapman Catt's winning plan, how that really made a difference for her.
Sure. So everything they did all year long, $38,000, and that covered, or was supposed to also cover, even what they sent out to the states. A year later, Mrs. Frank Leslie, who had been married several times, changed her name to Frank Leslie after her husband, the publisher, who died, leaving her his publishing business. And she turned it around. She had some scoops of etchings of Garfield, President Garfield's deathbed scene. And so out there, she died about of it. They had a new doing so poorly. They were doing the a lot of what's going to be in the exhibit here at the National Archives and is at the National Women's Party House in terms of cartoons and banners and automobiles and silent movies and just everything for publicity. And then also very importantly, they funded headquarters here in Washington, D.C. so that they could lobby Congress. And that was really Carrie Chapman Catt's plan, to have this massive education blitz across the At the same time, she was having the movement to pass the 19th Amendment, to pass a federal amendment, and to lobby Congress for that. And she could do all that at once because she had this $1 million donation.
Yeah. Well, anybody who works for a nonprofit organization and is grateful for every 25 cents that comes in is always wishing
They're all
for $1 million. Most definitely. So the lobbying and the political involvement and the education campaign, that's very similar to what Madam Walker was doing, but she was sort of doing it a little bit more person to person.
Right.
So the education component, when she was teaching her associates not only how to work in the industry, but she was also teaching them how to be politically engaged and how to be civic minded.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So, you think she dies in 19... Right. Women talked about not just, how to engage in politics, and they would do it as a group, even though they didn't have the right to vote. The recent riot in East St. Louis, organizing in mass demonstrations. The women had demonstrated at the White House. In 1917, African Americans marched up Fifth Avenue in what was called the Silent Protest Parade to protest these riots in East St. Louis. And they had banners, and they said a man has been lynched today. So of the NAACP who had organized that march. The next year in 1918, at her convention, she spoke out about the treatment of to be well by an African-American spy working for the War Department, and they were listed in documents that are in the National Archives as Negro subversives. So they were out, which made me learn even more. Was lose, but when you for a passport to go to Paris to observe the peace talks after World War I, and that passport was denied because of her political activism.
Interesting, interesting. Do you have a total of how much of her wealth she gave away?
So when she died, her will bequeathed $100,000 to various organizations. So it ranged from YMCA to to raise money, and she pledged 5 individual contribution that the NAACP had ever received. And when you that
Douglas home.
That's true. So those of you who have been to the Frederick Douglass home in Anacostia, she gave the largest donation, and was really a preservationist ahead of her time. I don't know that she would have considered herself that, but it meant that that home was preserved, and that was an initiative of the National Association of Colored Women, who were always sort of at the forefront of these kinds of things.
Yeah. Right.
Thanks for mentioning
that.
Yeah,
also really important.
But that really is key that it was around the same time.
That is interesting. That is interesting. So Joan, you had talked about also that this is not new, shocking history. We all know that the suffrage movement was, there were organizations that worked for suffrage that were inclusive and that were, that started that way, and that was a very key part of what they were doing. They were looking for universal suffrage. They were not looking for suffrage for white women or for only women that could read or could own property, etc. So when the suffrage campaign started moving forward and moved into the teens, and we started talking about these bigger dollars and NASA and the National Women's Party, it was largely segregated at that time. That doesn't mean that African American women weren't working for the vote. They were working very aggressively. They simply weren't working in those larger organizations. There was a very interesting part of your talk. Huge in the Belmont Hall. So she was a big player in suffrage for a lot of reasons. But in the very beginning, when she was first starting to work in suffrage, she was very clear to give money to African American groups who were working for suffrage. And then she pulled that support later. I found that very interesting. Can you give us just a little bit of information on that, what you found in your research?
Sure, and I think that move but political equality drew her into the labor movement. They had, and then pays for Harlem for this group. That
CREWTV at this point, you know that and have seen that the number of protests, the number of campaign just those So when we talk about the women's movement going forward, we've also talked about intersectionality today, in that did we learn our lessons from the suffrage movement and from the earlier equal rights movement in the 60s and 70s? That is still certainly part of what we're talking about. And as you look, back even in the last year, the Women's March on Washington and the after certainly, but there are also just people who are trying to do, I want to say off track, but have sort of not looked at it from the intersectional perspective that sometimes after the right to vote, I think they were looking for more than likely expediency and how was this actually going to get the vote to happen. And so there are varying ways you can interpret that, but I am really pleased with the amount of research that's going on right now and the amount of conversations that are taking place, because that is essentially how we're all going to learn as communities, and we're all going to make that better. So I think we'll have time for questions from all of you, but I want to finish with one question for Sarah. In the report, in this most recent report, about the number of women who support female candidates. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I find that to be very interesting.
You're right. So like I had mentioned earlier, women, this cycle we've seen 39 candidates who get just his sort of presence in the political system, and that's starting to women candidates, male candidates are included in that bunch too. Bernie Sanders this cycle, right. Mike Quigley, and some other men have also started realizing that women have money. There's several things happening simultaneously. And I hate to keep bringing up Sanders and Clinton, but it's just too relevant and recent. Sanders showed that you could run a relatively successful campaign with donations from women. And so that combination means that you haven't in the past. And again, this is mostly to the earlier points about race. There certainly are intersectional issues that still linger today. There isn't great data on race and candidates. It just isn't collected by anyone in a systematic way, which is crazy to me. But people of color get less money than their white counterparts. People of color who are women get less money than their female counterparts who are white. And there's a bunch of reasons for that that you can think of. We haven't looked at it systematically. I hate to say there's a small n problem, but there is a small n problem since we're talking about Congress. And so those issues certainly linger, but I think that these two most recent cycles have shown candidates that there are multiple paths to success, and that even though we're in a post-Citizens United era where a single rich donor, usually a man, can drop $25 million in an election, just like that, they've also shown that there are ways that candidates can be competitive, playing by completely different rules. And Sanders and Clinton both show those examples.
Right. What are some of the trends that you see from your data as you track all of these numbers?
The disparate movement between Republicans and Democratic women is the big one for me. Democrats have just skyrocketed in the number of candidates, and Republicans have stayed flat. And it just, every cycle I see it, but this cycle, it just is so much more striking because there's just so many competitors right now. And we know that women voted for Trump. So there have to be Republican women out there in the world, obviously, but they're not running for office. Maybe they're not being recruited. Maybe they don't have the infrastructure with groups like Emily's List in place to support their candidacies once they start running. That's a big part of that. Right. Maybe they get less support from the parties. That's also true. They're more likely to face negative political advertising. That's true for all women once they start running. So there are all of these hurdles. And while the Democrats have sort of made it part of folded it into their mission to highlight representation, the Republicans just haven't embraced that, and recently have done the opposite. And so that is just creating this separation. And then the second thing on that is that we've seen a big divide in the way that women who have occupations are contributing to political data. 90s, homemakers, self-reported homemakers donated about equally to Republicans and Democrats. Now homemakers are much more likely to donate to Republicans, and occupation-holding women are much more likely to donate to Democrats. And so that disconnect is, I mean, that's fascinating. It speaks to culture wars. It speaks to the kind of women that the party is embracing. And I think it really is indicative of a greater problem of polarization for both of the political parties.
Absolutely. I thought that was fascinating that that was one of the major points in the report. And of course, it was Jones. There was something in your report that talked about it was possible that those votes and or those donations were family donations or they were proxy. Points that you brought up. Women needed to be above the fray and not in the deep and dirty of the politics. And anyway, they were just going to vote however their husband told them to vote anyway. I thought that was very interesting. Here we are 100 years later, and these are still some of the things that are being talked about. So again, it's fascinating. So we do have time for questions. If anybody, we've got microphones on both the left and the right side, if anybody would like to. And I wanted to ask, in the meantime, if you all want to go start lining up, I wanted to ask Alelia.
Doing research. My editor does not want to hear that. With a biography on Madam Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker, my namesake, who lived in Harlem during the 20s. She moved to Harlem in 1913 when African Americans were really starting to move uptown. She was one of the first people to actually buy property, first African Americans to buy property, and she opened her townhouse with the Walker Salon and Beauty School on the bottom floor. And then after her mother died in 1919, she inherited the mansion, the family mansion in Irvington, New York, which is now a National Historic Landmark. And then she was known for the great parties that she gave. She knew all of the artists and writers and musicians and actors, and it was a really great place for a wide variety of people to come and meet each other and enjoy themselves. So both people in Harlem and people from downtown and international crowds of people came. And she also traveled internationally. She went to Paris, Rome for the coronation of the Pope, Addis Ababa to meet the Empress in 1921 and 22.
Isn't that amazing? It's absolutely amazing. I've been meaning to ask you this, where are your family archives? Where's the records?
So, we're really fortunate that there was one of Madam Walker's secretaries who was my neighbor when I was growing up, had sort of squirreled everything away. The company actually never went out of business, but the Historical Society. Adam Walker Family Archives that are in my house. So I finished this book.
Got it. Okay. Why don't we start here? Questions, go right ahead.
Thank you to all the panelists for everything you've shared tonight. It's been fascinating. This question is for any of you, but maybe for Sarah. I'm curious if you see any trends in ages of women and generations. As a young women voter, I'm curious as to what some of those differences might be.
Excellent.
That's a great question. And our data really rely on information that's reported, and age, unfortunately, isn't something that we have easy access to. However, the incumbency question speaks to that a little bit. I mean, last cycle, around 95% of, sort of based on logic, you would assume that those people are older than their challengers. See retirements already surpassing previous. Expect those people. I haven't looked at it systematically, unfortunately, just because it's just not a value that's reported in the data.
Interesting. Why don't we go over here?
Two questions for Sarah. What has been the impact of big data on fundraising? You know, I mean, and with big data, they know more about you and me than you and brothers ad infinitum. Is there anything equivalent to like a cock, a cock sister? Any feminist sisters? With access to a lot of money who are throwing it around.
Oh,
Those are
interesting.
both great questions.
Yeah.
And I'll let you guys maybe speak to some of the networks ones. But for the big data, that's an open question. I think that understand what's happening with Facebook and Twitter. And you're right, people know a lot. I mean, I live in a competitive house. The impact is such that campaigns are just getting more sophisticated. Sophisticated campaigns take money to run. And so it's kind of driving up the cost. As for the Koch sisters, this is really a recent example. There's a pair whose names I'm going to butcher from Indiana of sisters, Cindy Simon, and do you know that?
No, but in it.
Yeah,
but in it.
yeah, in it. Yeah, and case about where we put him on the spectrum, but contributing to the super PACs in the same way that the Republicans have. And the Democrats have just generally been much slower to embrace these big money vessels than have the Republicans. They got on that quite quickly, whereas the Democrats have sort of, largely spurred by Barack Obama's sort of disdain for them, sort of hemmed and hawed, but now recently are starting to capitalize on those.
And if you widen that question just to think about wealthy women today funding women's causes more generally, not necessarily just within politics, there's an organization called Women Moving Millions, which is led by Swanee Hunt and her sister. And they've gotten pledges from something like 300 women who are all giving $1 million or more to women's causes, and that's really growing. So that's kind of a growing movement also.
And when is my party not really where I'm at and I have to do what I need to do, maybe through nonpartisan means or whatever.
I don't really know enough about what women of just did, and knowing, what party do I belong in, and when do I go out on my own, and when do I cling to the party, and sort of, when women were getting the vote, and was there one party that supported them more than others, and anyway, when to be with the party and when to not. Any insight you have, I'd be happy to hear it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
We're
so polarized right now. Issue, not the party, but certainly one example that I know of historically, which might not apply now, is one of the people who was who worked with the Walker Company, a woman named Dr. Marjorie Stewart Joyner, who was the principal of the Walker schools, worked for both Madam Walker and for Mary McLeod Bethune. As you probably know, many African Americans, most African Americans, when they had the right to vote in the early 20th century, late 19th century, voted for Republicans because that was the with way
very through states that had already passed suffrage should punish. They thought a poor strategy. They were working so hard to cultivate and lobby politicians and legislators that they really thought taking that kind of aggressive approach and threatening, essentially, using their political power to threaten them into doing what they wanted.
Holding was what Alice Paul and others learned in England when they were working with the Pankhursts. That was one of the big things that she brought back, that and the militant tactics and strategies.
And maybe the right answer is both, because it really took having both NASA and the NWP to each have their own approach that ultimately push it through.
Definitely. Right here.
Something for our own time. Who here can think about the kids in high school that are just about to turn 18 and who I hope are registering to vote in droves? Do you think they really will? Do you think they really will go to the polls? Do you think they are a source of money? And is that going to last? Are they going to stick with it? Are they going to grow up and be us?